Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, Microsoft is now going to have 3 different iterations of the Xbox One. In fact, I could have done a video on this a long time ago, and I probably should have, but due to scheduling conflicts, I really wasn't able to talk about it until now. And again, because of scheduling conflicts, I'm shooting this footage way before this video is going to come out, so some information could become out of date by the time you actually see it. I apologize, it's just the nature of work. But anyway, let's talk about it. Basically, a lot of people have been asking me, you know, Adam, you obviously care a lot about video game consoles. What would you recommend I pick up? Because I'm thinking about getting an Xbox One. Should I get the Xbox One, the Xbox One S, or the Xbox One Scorpio? The answer, well, the short version, if that's all you care about, I would probably recommend the Scorpio. But if you want to know how we got to that conclusion, stick around. Little history lesson first. Xbox One, of course, is Microsoft's current generation game console, the 8th generation game console. And we learned at E3 2016 that they are going to be releasing something called the Xbox One S, which is nothing new and yet is new. And what I mean by that is, if you look at consoles throughout history, the successful ones, a lot of them end up, after a few years into the console cycle, get what's called a slim model, which is essentially, I assume, what Xbox One S actually stands for. Basically, a slim model is, it's redesigned, it looks different, it's usually more power efficient, it's usually smaller, it usually has a couple different tweaks here and there, some ports that weren't used are removed and other ones are added, you know, things like that. And then they make, you know, additional other just little changes here and there, right? That's nothing new. Happens all the time. The Xbox One S is a little different in that they made some changes to the controller, like the grip is better, they added some Bluetooth capabilities to the controller. The console itself is now 4K video capable. It'll have a 4K Blu-ray player in it, as well as 4K Netflix capabilities. It has a couple other tweaks in it, such as potentially, depending on which version you get, it has bigger hard drives. There is a 500GB version, just like the original Xbox One. I hate saying that sentence, which I'll explain in a minute. There's a 1TB model. We've seen that before as well with the Xbox One original version. And now there's a 2TB model. I believe that's new. I don't think the original Xbox One ever had that. So it'll have that, and it will have a couple of other bells and whistles in it that make games slightly more improved. But overall, it's essentially the exact same console. It just looks different. It's a little bit more efficient. So that's an option. And then there's Xbox One Scorpio. Now, Microsoft announced that at the end of E3 2016, and the idea was that it's going to be a 4K gaming capable console. I know a lot of people, even in the comments of this video, I'm sure will be like, no, fuck you, that's impossible, they could never totally ever do that. People have been getting really angry about that shit. Even before this was ever confirmed. People just do not want to accept that that is a possibility because it's not cost effective. But we'll talk about that in a minute. I swear we will. Okay, now the original Xbox One, alright, again, I promise I'll go over in a minute. I just want to rant about that name for a second. There was a console called the Xbox, okay? You remember this thing? Alright, and then after the Xbox 360 came out, some people started calling the Xbox the original Xbox, and other people called it, there were people calling it the Xbox One, because it was the first one, right? And then when the Xbox One became a real thing, people went, well, we can't call it the Xbox One anymore, so let's call it the original Xbox. Okay. And sometimes people even call that the original Xbox One. So now, moving on a couple years later, we now have something actually called the original Xbox One. Microsoft, stop it with the terrible naming conventions. Please, I beg you. Alright, but anyway, that's just a side nerd rant. But anyway, the original Xbox One. That version of the console, I would only really recommend you if you're on a budget. Because I guarantee this holiday season of 2016, those things will be cleansed from stores, probably super cheap just to get rid of them. I don't think they're producing those anymore. Much like with the Fat 360s, when they were done with those, they got them the fuck out of the stores and they got them out for pretty cheap because they would just want to get rid of them. They'll probably bundle in a lot of games. It'll probably be a very attractive package if you're on a budget. But be warned, that version of the console realistically will only have support for probably another 3 years. Microsoft is saying that all Scorpio titles, when they're made, will function on Xbox One, and I believe them to a point. I think mathematically it's just impossible that they'll go beyond like 2 or 3 years of support. I'm calling it now. I'm telling you 3. They'll still have like online support. All that shit will still be there. And there may be games specifically tailor-made for the Xbox One, but I think your AAA games will stop being produced for the original Xbox One within probably 3 years. That's my guess. Again, I could be wrong. Now, moving on to the Xbox One S, I have to admit I think this is the most pointless version of the console. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a really neat slim model, and I would be much more excited about it if it weren't for the Scorpio's impending release, because it seems to me that it's rather pointless. It's really going to only be around for like 1 year, where it's like the dominant version of the Xbox One, before it's inevitably replaced by the Scorpio and then has to run alongside it. Now, the Xbox One S, while it does have certain upgrades over the original version of the Xbox One, it is fundamentally limited to basically the same thing. So when AAA titles stop being made for the original Xbox One, they're essentially stop being made for the Xbox One S. The primary reason to get the Xbox One S is if you're someone like me where you just like to buy new hardware, new tech, new consoles, and just kind of enjoy them that way. Because from a gaming standpoint, not much is going to change. But if you're looking to get a 4K Blu-ray player, this could be the version for you. Because in addition to getting 4K Blu-ray capabilities, you'd have all the media functions as well as an Xbox on top of that. So that's hard to dispute. That is actually pretty nice. But I think ultimately what I would tell you is just wait for the Scorpio. And depending on the price point of the Scorpio, that is when you should determine which version of the console you really should have between the Xbox One S and the Xbox Scorpio. By the time the Xbox Scorpio's price point is announced, the original Xbox One will be long gone. You won't be able to get it anymore except through used outlets and stuff. But I mean, here's the thing with the Xbox One Scorpio. A lot of people think if this thing's going to be real, it has to cost like $1,500. And some people say, oh, as low as like $1,000. Here's the thing. The Xbox One Scorpio, in case you're unaware, it might as well be a 9th video game generation console, because the hardware in it is supposed to be 4K gaming capable. It's going to be leaps and bounds above what the current version of the Xbox One and Xbox One S is. And under any other era, we would have just called it a 9th video game generation console. In fact, the amount of time between the launch of the Xbox One and the Xbox One Scorpio when it comes out will have been the same amount of time between the original Xbox and the Xbox 360. So why aren't we calling this a 9th video game generation? Well, according to Microsoft, these are all the same console. This one just has additional improvements, etc., etc. They are essentially adopting the smartphone model. When you get a smartphone, it has all your apps on there, it has your contacts, all that stuff, but every couple of years you have to get a new one where they just migrate all the data over and the hardware is better. Supposedly that's the model they're using. I could talk about that in of itself at a later time, but that's essentially what we're told they're doing. So what they're claiming is that Xbox One Scorpio games will work on the original Xbox One and the Xbox One S, but because of the hardware limitations, they won't run in 4K. So if a game is made for the Scorpio, according to Microsoft, it has to work on the other two. It's just that if it runs in 4K at like 60 frames per second or whatever on the Scorpio, that's not possible on the others. So when those consoles detect it, they'll be like, okay, we got to run this at like 720p at 30 frames per second. Do you understand what I'm saying? Textures won't be as good, that kind of stuff. It'll be watered down, but will work. But I think inevitably there's going to come a point where developers just say, I don't want to have to try and make these games work on, like, at that point it might be like, 6-year-old hardware. They may not want to do that anymore. So that's when I think you'll stop seeing AAA titles on the older versions of the console. So I guess what I'm telling you is, I think you should get the Scorpio, but pricing. Now, again, because people speculate how this thing might be obscenely priced, if that's true, then maybe stick with the Xbox One S. But I do want to throw out a little nugget here, okay? People say that they won't... Alright, so what would you think is a realistic price point for the Xbox One Scorpio? For it to be successful, it can't be more than $500. That's like the cap. In fact, I would probably tell them you got to go with like $400. And then, of course, if you're sitting there laughing, be like, there's no fucking way they could ever make it for that cheap, blah, 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 you're not wrong. but you underestimate Microsoft's wallet and the history of video games. Here's the thing with most video game consoles, they're sold at a loss. This isn't always the case, but a lot of consoles, the most infamous example in history is the fat model of the PlayStation 3. That thing cost $900 to build per unit, and Sony sold them for $600 at launch and had to eventually strip out stuff to make it cheaper, etc., etc. And if you're like, why the hell would they do that? There's no way that's true. One, it's absolutely 100% true. But second, why would they do that? The whole idea was that they were trying to make you think, oh, you're getting this really good deal, and then they would end up making money on the games. If the console is successful, like the PlayStation 2, for example, and the PlayStation 1, both were more expensive to produce than they sold them for, but they made money back because they were so wildly successful they were able to make all the money on the games. PlayStation 3 wasn't the same story. Sony can't do that with the PlayStation 4. That's why the PlayStation 4 was very modest, and they ended up making, I think it was like $18 or something per launch unit, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's much better than losing money on every unit. And then when the console was a juggernaut success, they were making money on the games as well as the hardware. That's a holy trifecta, except it's not 3, but you get my point. It's the idea, it's the goal, it's what you want, is to make money on the thing. Microsoft has had no real success with the Xbox One, not in the way they would want it. And so what they could do is adopt that lose money on the hardware model, because they know Sony can't. They can't afford to do that. Sony is not in a financial position to be able to do that anymore. Microsoft is. So Microsoft actually could do that with the Scorpio. They could actually make a $1,000 console that they sell to you for $400. They would lose a shit ton of money, but if they're selling tons and tons of units, and then everybody's like, fuck PlayStation, you know, and potentially fuck PC, I know, that'll never happen, and fuck Nintendo, etc., then if everybody's moving over to Xbox hardware, they kind of win, because that's where everybody's buying their games. Especially because, again, and here's why, you know, the olive branch to the PC gamers, because you're linking it up with Windows 10. All these Xbox One games, as Microsoft announced, will be Xbox One and Windows 10 cross-platform. So it's possible that that's all part of the same. It's hard. It's like the tapestry that you know, I'm using like a crystal ball to see what I think they're going to do, and that's kind of what I think their plan is to make the Xbox One Scorpio a version of the console that's much more expensive to produce than they sell it for, in an effort to just get units in the homes, get their brand up, get the name recognition back in there, make Xbox a very relevant thing to games, and then gradually through that, whatever you call it, a generation, half a generation, whatever the fuck it is, gradually kind of migrate everyone over to PCs through their service. I think that's what they're doing. So long story short, if you're looking to get an Xbox One, the original version, it's really only there if you want to do this on a budget. Xbox One Scorpio is probably the way to go, but it does obviously require the most patience. But it also would require to have full utilization that you have a 4K television. But by next year, that might be more affordable, etc. The Xbox One S, honestly, I think really only appeals to either collectors or to people who have never owned an Xbox One, are kind of curious about getting into it, but are also really more interested in like media function than gaming itself. Or people who are just in a rush to get an Xbox One and don't want to wait another year. Unfortunately, that's kind of where I see it, because that version of the console seems the most pointless to me. So I hope that helps. I know this was kind of an all over the place video, but I hope there was a little bit of insight in there for you. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.